moving on about the value of ISO and standards in general. Promoting an integrated process approach, which is very germane to ITIL and IT service management. The thing that stands out about ISO is that it is auditable. So of all of the practices that are out there, if there is an interest to actually audit towards the delivery of that, then ISO is where you go. ISO is really keen on not only that you're doing it, how you're doing it, but more importantly, how well are you documenting and training and then measuring to those standards and then continually improving and changing those standards. There is a 7-step process for certification. I'm not going to cover that in great detail because again, I think certification is a nice to have. It's not a have to have unless it's something that you really want to do to stand out in a competitive circumstance, like I described with those 2 bicycle shops. But if you're not in the core delivery of IT services as your core business, then it may not be a good investment to get certified, depending on your marketplace. But it certainly doesn't mean that you don't have the opportunity to use this as part of your tool set. If you do go for certification, then there are impartial bodies that do that. And there are certain requirements that have to be met. If you look at the ISO 20000 standards guidance, I boiled it down into a spreadsheet to use as kind of a measuring stick. And I came up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 questions that need to be answered. And in order to be certified, you have to answer all of those questions yes, and you have to be able to prove it. So it's a pretty rigorous effort to go through to get certified from front to back. But however, that doesn't stop you from using those questions and using that information as a yardstick for moving forward to mature your organization. Now, there is one thing that they call out, and this is pretty standard across all of the ISO delivery certifications, and that is something called a management system. So in the ISO 9000 world, they call it a quality management system, a QMS. In the ISO 20000 world, since we're talking about services, delivery of IT services, we call it a service management system. And really, when you boil that down, the quality management system and the service management system are really just a way of making sure that you keep your documentation consistent, current, up-to-date, measured, and that you are adhering to the guidance within your management system. So it could be, I mean, in the old days of 9000 and manufacturing, oftentimes if you would go out on the manufacturing floor and you go into the supervisor's office, you'd see a series of books, binders stacked up on a shelf. And that was where the way that they kept their quality management system under control and up to date. Of course, nowadays we've replaced that with electronic, typically things like SharePoint. But the rigor that goes into that management system is really a good thing if you want to continue to monitor and manage towards a set of standards or practices. You really need to document it well. It needs to be written down. It needs to be version controlled, change controlled. Then you need to have a plan for implementing it and enforcing it across your organization, measuring the effectiveness and the adherence to those processes, and then finally having plans for continual service improvement. So the management system, no matter whether it's 20000 or 9000 or any other set of ISO standards that you're adhering to, the management system is a great practice to implement because it forces that documentation update. I worked with a client years ago that asked us to come in and do an assessment on the maturity of their processes. And this particular organization, it was a fairly large manufacturing company, but they were asking us to look at their IT service management. And so they had implemented ITIL processes. The date stands out to me very clearly because it was June 6, 2006. So everything was dated 6/6/6. And then they asked us to come in about 4 years later and do an assessment on how they were doing in terms of maintaining that. So first thing I did was me and the team asked to see their documentation, their management system. And lo and behold, we looked at the revision tables of all of their documents, all their process documents. And of course, everything was dated 6/6/6 as the initial release. And then there was no revisions up until about 2 months before we had been asked to come in. So obviously what had happened was, you know, reading the tea leaves here, they had gone in with the best of intent, and they had initiated their process, and they were moving to a managed services model. And then they didn't update any of their management system and documentation until they realized they were going to be audited. So obviously the rigor wasn't there that needed to be there, because you want to make sure that you're revisiting that on an as-needed basis, because I refuse to believe that business stayed static for that many years, that their customers remained static and their needs and requirements remained static. I just don't believe that was true. I think they weren't diligent about updating their documentation. And really that should be done on a 6-month to 1-year basis at a minimum. And if you're in the ISO certification process, you're going to get re-audited on probably at least a yearly basis. And then they're going to come back and probably recertify you in about 2 years' time. So, you know, keeping that management system up to date, it's critical for the certification, but it's a great practice just for the fact that it keeps you honest on keeping your documentation up to date.